Hey guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to make sourdough bread from scratch. So there's a few things that you need. You need a bowl, something to mix everything in, a scale. I'm using a digital scale, but anything that goes down to at least a gram is good enough. A dough scraper or bench scraper is what they call this sometimes. This is going to be a fantastic tool that you're definitely going to want to use. Ingredients wise, you just need some plain old water. You need some sea salt or regular salt. I'm using pure sea salt from Costco. It's just a salt that I found that I like the best. I've tried some other salts, but this one is just consistent, always the same, and gives me the same results I like every time. I'm going to be using King Arthur bread flour, maybe a little bit of King Arthur all-purpose flour. If you want, you can switch out a little bit of the flour, maybe 25% of the weight of the flour, and we'll go over baker's percentage in just a sec. For whole wheat flour if you want to add some whole wheat, but today just going to be doing pure white flour. And last but not least, you're going to need a starter, and I'm keeping my starter in this plastic container. I fed it last night. It's a little bit active. We'll go over how to tell if a starter is active later in the video or not. And yeah, that's it. So let's get baking. All right, kids, we're going to talk about baker's percentages. So what baker's percentages are the different ratios of ingredients by weight in relation to flour. So what that means is that in every recipe, flour is always going to be 100% of the weight. So that can be broken down into different components. So you could have 75% bread flour, 25% whole wheat flour. That equates to 100% of the flour. And then every other ingredient in the recipe is based off of that number. So if you have 65% water in the recipe, that means that 65% of the total weight of flour is going to be the weight of the water that you're going to use. So if we're looking at a recipe like this, where we have 75% bread flour, 25% whole wheat flour, yada yada for the rest, then in terms of weight, what we're going to do is say, if we want to use 1,000 grams of flour here, then we're going to need to use 650 grams of water, 200 grams of sourdough starter or levain, and then 20 grams of salt. So the great thing about baker's percentages is that you can use any weight that you really want as long as all the other ratios are the same. And that's the most important part that you need to know. All right, first things first, what we want to do, turn on the scale. Probably need to take the bowl off first to do that. Zero it out, put the bowl on, tear the scale down to 0. Then we take our starter and we're going to put in about 100 grams of this. 107, you know what? That's completely fine. My baking is not super precise, and I'm okay with that. Tear the scale. So for this dough, don't want to make it too wet of a dough, so I think that I'm going to start around 320 grams of water, roughly. 350, so this will be about like a 70% hydration. 347, that's gonna be totally fine. We don't need to be super precise about this. One thing I do wanna do, mix it up a little bit first. Make sure to dissolve that starter. Perfect. Next, going to add flour, and with this recipe, going to be using 500 grams of flour total. So first tear the scale down to 0. Flour, about 470, 1. Now I'm just kind of like eyeballing this. Doesn't need to be super specific or super precise, just kind of doing what I feel like. As long as you get to right around 500 grams, 504, it's gonna work out perfectly fine. Next, we mix. So you can use a finger, you can use a fork, you can use a spoon, you can use whatever you want, but as long as you just start mixing the flour into the water and the starter. So right here is where our handy dandy bench scraper comes in handy. I don't like having all of this flour stuck on my fingers, so what you do, you just scrape it right off. Good as new, basically. So also with this, you want to scrape down the sides of the bowl, make sure you're getting all the flour. Don't worry about all this stuff spilling right here. We're gonna put the flour on the countertop anyways. And I like to cut into the dough. When you cut into the dough like this, you kind of expose the wet parts of the dough and help those wet parts get some of that dry flour that hasn't been absorbed yet. You're doing this, and it slowly becomes this sort of like cohesive dough form. And that's what we want. So first, this is a point, a little bit before this point, you could do the auto-lease method if you want, but I think for now, we're just gonna leave it as this, and we're going to measure out our salt. So bringing our scale back in, tearing to 0. I guess I could do that with the full on. And since we want about 2% salt in this recipe, we have about 500 grams of flour. We are going to add in about 10 grams. Salt is probably one of the ingredients that I try to get the most precise in relation to the flour, at least, because it's going to be something that affects the flavor and the texture probably the most. All right, now that we have that, I usually like to let this wait and sit for, maybe 20 minutes or so. So in the meantime, what I'm going to do is just wrap some plastic wrap over the bowl. Just like that. And then we're gonna wait 20 minutes. We're gonna come back and add the salt in and knead it. So it's been about 20 minutes since we've been letting this sit. So let's take this off. We have our dough here. We have our salt that we measured out. And what I'm going to do is just sprinkle the salt all over the top. Take my dough scraper and start doing the cutting in technique again. Get this mixed up. Now at this point you should notice that the dough is a much different texture than it was when you first left it. And that happens when you let it sit for a while. What's happening there is basically that the water is actually getting to all of the dry bits of flour, and the flour is absorbing all that water, becoming a lot softer, and you end up with this nice texture. So you've probably seen a lot of recipes that are no knead breads, kneading very little, but do you know what? I like kneading. It's fun, it's cool, it's good for the soul, and I think you should do it sometimes. So what we're gonna do is knead this bread. There's a couple different techniques that you can do. If you watch some random videos of classic bakeries, French bakeries, they'll be doing a technique where they scoop it from the bottom, smack the bread down, flip it over itself, and do that over and over. This is usually best with high hydration doughs. So doughs with a lot of water in it that are really wet and malleable. This is how you can incorporate a lot of air and structure into the dough. Since this is a 65% dough, roughly, what I'm gonna do is just like the normal kneading method. So all I'm gonna do, lay it out flat, press my palm in, fold it over the top, and repeat that process all the way around for a long time. Yeah, quite a long time is what I'm gonna do this for. Then, after you're done kneading it, you're going to feel that the texture is going to be very different. So right now, if you can see, the dough is kind of like scraggly looking, not very smooth or uniform. The longer you knead it, the better it's going to get. But you might not be able to see that right away. What you might need to do is knead it for about 10 minutes or so, just the way that I'm doing it right now. Flip it over, roll it up a little bit, take your bowl or plastic wrap, set it over the top, Let this rest for another 10 minutes after kneading it for about 10 minutes. And then when you come back, it's gonna be much smoother and much nicer to work with. And then you're gonna wanna knead it a little bit more for another like 10 minutes or so. And then what you're gonna do is you have two options. First, you wanna roll it up, put it back in your bowl, and then you can let this sit overnight in the refrigerator or in a very cool area like in a garage on a cold night, or you can just let it ferment at room temperature for about 5 to 8 hours, depending on what time you start the dough at, and then we're going to bake it. So the pan that I like to use for baking is classic cast iron Dutch oven. Just put the loaf right in here, put the lid back on. So just for a quick reference, this has been sitting for roughly 10 minutes after I kneaded it for the first time. And as you can see, it becomes a lot smoother in texture and a lot less of a scraggly bit of a mess. So if you roll it up, like you can see how much smoother the dough is now. All right, so this has been fermenting for about 5 hours now. So what we're gonna do is shape it. I have a banneton, which I'm going to use to shape this. Otherwise, if you don't have that, then you can just simply use a towel, open it up, sprinkle some flour on this, and after it's shaped, put it on this, and then put it into a bowl. And then that works just fine too. But I'm not going to do that. So to shape it, take it out of the bowl. If you want, you can flour the bottom of the surface, whatever you're working on. I'm not going to. Fold one side over, fold the other side over, that, and then just kind of wrap it around itself. Just like that. You want to let this sit for about 20 minutes and then do a final shape and then flour and put inside here. So after the bread has been resting for about 3 hours, what we want to do is we first want to flour the surface of the dough because the dough is pretty sticky at this point on top. So what we're going to do, just take some flour, sprinkle it all over the top of the dough. Just a little bit, not too much, and just kind of brush off some of the excess flour that we don't want lying around. Then you can take a baking pan, I'm using a cookie sheet. If you don't have a pizza peel or a bread peel, flip the dough on over, smack it down, hopefully nothing sticks. And what we're gonna do is just kind of wipe some of the excess flour off from around the sides. And you could be using a brush for this if you want, but I'm being lazy right now and would rather just use my hands. Now what we want to do is we want to score it, and we're going to use a bread lame. This is a very sharp object that cuts the bread and just kind of helps control the rise. So there's a bunch of different types of cuts you can do. You can do different patterns of any sorts that you want. It's all up to you, complete personal preference. And when you're cutting, you want to make sure that you have a really shallow angle. So don't angle the lame too high. But you want it nearly parallel with the dough, just like so. Then what we're going to do, take my handy dandy oven gloves and transfer it to the oven, put the lid on the Dutch oven once the bread goes in, and bake it for about 50 minutes. In the last 10 minutes of baking, I like to take the lid off of the Dutch oven and let the bread finish off. Here's the bread, finally done. You know that it's done if you can hear hollow sound, nice color, good ear on it, and let's cut it open and see how it looks on the inside. So crusty. I think it turns out pretty well. I think it was pretty good. So that's how you make delicious sourdough bread. Hope you guys like this video. See you next time.